Hello, and welcome to Ask Dr. Dawn. The opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers, and this is a program intended for education and entertainment. It should not be construed as a substitute for a medical consultation. Well, I thought we'd start out with a little bit of discussion of how to read a science paper, and I've chosen as my material something you may have heard about in the news. This has been hitting the networks lately. Adolescent cannabis use and risk of psychotic, bipolar, depressive, and anxiety disorders. And this is an important study in some ways, but not for the things that the news media has been pushing. It doesn't really prove anything, and the title, I think, suggests a cause and effect relationship where none exists, or at least the way it's been covered by the press does. So let's start out with, first of all, a couple of blanket statements that you always have to keep in mind whenever you are looking at a news article and you say, that doesn't sound quite right to me. I think I will actually go look at the source material. And oh my God, my friends, if you actually check the references on a whole ton of the websites that, it's a blog post and then they have references at the bottom, and they've even got little numbers, after statements within the blog, and then you actually go and look up the reference, and I can't tell you how many times I've said, that doesn't sound right to me. Let me go look at the evidence for that. And the article that they've referenced doesn't actually say what they say. They're either deliberately or accidentally misinterpreting it. Maybe they just read the title of the article and decided it was germane to that sentence. I don't know. But all I can tell you is you've actually got to go to the source material. If it just doesn't smell right, you're going to want to actually put a little time into it before you pass it along, please. Because a lot of that stuff there is just click and share bait. And when you share garbage with your friends and neighbors, you don't do anybody any favors, including yourself, I might add. So, epidemiology, limited by lots of things, but most basically by truth-telling, because epidemiology, you're generally asking people about their diet, about their behavior, and, they may not tell you the truth. In fact, there may be strong reasons they shouldn't tell you the truth. Truth-telling is not a universal adolescent or adult skill. Most people can do it voluntarily, but many choose not to do it, also voluntarily, for reasons of secondary gain or fear. So that's a problem. That's a problem with diet studies, and it's definitely a problem when you're asking teenagers about their cannabis use. Another problem with this paper is the association. They use that word a lot. Association does not equal causation. The chicken doesn't, it's like the chicken and the egg are linked, but you can choose which direction you want to take that, right? The egg hatches into a chicken. Well, there you go. The egg causes the chicken, but then again, the chicken lays the egg. So causality is not proven by association. The other thing about this paper, and we'll get into this when I go into the details, but it's a big problem, is that this paper conflates ever using marijuana or cannabis with heavy use of marijuana and cannabis. And this is fundamentally a very big problem. These two things are not the same, and we'll go into that a little bit. So I'm going to demonstrate my technique for deconstructing a paper to see if I believe the headlines. And I think I've already, spoiler alert, I've already told you that the headlines do not actually reflect the findings in this paper. And even the researchers are careful to say that late in the paper when they get into the discussion. But in their abstract and introduction, they make quite a few statements. Let's start out with what this study actually is. Well, for one thing, it's very, very, very big. They included adolescents between the ages of 13 to 17 who were in Kaiser and went in for a well child visit between 2016 and 2023. Now, in that age group, they're usually sports physicals or birth control visits, 13 to 17. But there might be, a well child person who actually shows up for a well child visit, but it's rare. It's usually coded that way, but it's for a distinct purpose. Adolescents that participated during that period were followed up through the age of 25 or until the end of 2023. And they analyzed the data in the last couple of years. So the first thing, and I will also say they tried very hard to adjust for sex, race, ethnicity, neighborhood deprivation index, insurance type, alcohol, other substance abuse, all the other variables that would come to mind. They were also really interested in the ethnic and racial breakdown, and they remember this was, a few years back that they set this up when such data were not, the kiss of death for research. But let's get to the nitty gritty here. They had almost 500,000 adolescents in that age range, 396. And they were ethnically pretty evenly divided, about 30% Hispanic, about 20% non-Hispanic Asian, about 30% non-Hispanic white, and about 7% non-Hispanic black. And remember, this is Northern California, so that pretty much reflects our ethnic background. So, truth-telling. Let's start with that problem. Other studies have shown that, and studies I might add, not in a doctor's office where your parent would have potentially access to your medical record, show 11.2% of adolescents in anonymous studies reporting cannabis use in the last year. But in this study, only 5.7% of Northern California, cannabis is legal, et cetera, reported use. I think a lot of people had used cannabis in the last 12 months and simply were not going to cop to it. The paper then goes on to discuss the associations in previous small studies that have found that cannabis use in early adolescence, daily use, cannabis use disorder, or use of higher strength products is associated, there's that word again, associated with increasing risk of developing schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders. Now, I'm going to give you a counterfactual that fits that evidence that I think may be a large factor here and very hard to study, and that is that people don't just wake up one day with schizophrenia. It's a disorder that develops in adolescence in most people. In fact, the old name for it was dementia praecox meaning early or premature. So premature dementia, schizophrenia, problems with telling reality from what's going on inside your head, all sorts of flavors of schizophrenia out there. We're doing a blanket diagnosis for medical coding purposes, and that's the data they've got. I would argue that schizophrenia, as we know, develops over time, and the symptoms early are agitation and having things not seem to function logically intermittently. And that's going to be upsetting, and it's going to drive one to do something to relax. And marijuana is widely available to adolescents. So is schizophrenia hidden and denied initially? Yes. Could a person in that setting be more likely to seek out and use marijuana, particularly, or other forms of cannabis daily or at higher levels, attempting to, treat themselves? I think it's plausible. So let's just say that might be a reason for the association. In other words, schizophrenia may be a risk factor for cannabis use rather than the other way around. Now, studies have found that adolescents and adults with cannabis use disorder have a greater risk of developing bipolar disease. and the greatest risk is seen immediately after the cannabis use disorder diagnosis. And let me say that cannabis use disorder is not going to pay for much therapy. So there's another confound in there in the sense that, yeah, they get a diagnosis of bipolar so we can treat them and get paid for treating them, and they need to be treated, and cannabis use disorder isn't going to cut it with the insurer. And you can always find motivations. Doctors sometimes, the diagnoses are sometimes gamed to finance something for the good of the patient. And yeah, we'll do that kind of sophistic compromise, if you will. And it's plausible diagnosis, and they are certainly acting as if they were bipolar. So why don't we just use that diagnosis so that we can actually get the therapy and the drugs paid for? And remember, this is a large HMO, so I think that is also something that we have to consider. The diagnosis sometimes isn't accurate, it's just convenient. Think about autism for a moment. Now, autism has, the diagnosis has gone through amazing mission creep, and I've talked about this on the program, and I'm sure you've heard other stuff along these lines before. But what happens is autism is a serious disease, and you're going to need, if you're a public school, extra funding to manage those children and try to mainstream them as much as possible. Once there's extra funding involved, there's every reason for the schools to devote some of their budget to screening for children who are autistic, their behavior problems, their classroom disruption. If they're authentically autistic, then the school will get extra money, and it probably pays for the screening and then some to go ahead and make that investment. So there becomes an incentive to find the cases. We see this happen when a new drug is developed that treats a condition that hasn't previously been treatable. A lot of advertising and education. Did you know, we can clear your psoriasis with just a single injection every month. And before long, you've got, all sorts of very psychologically effective advertising going out trying to find people with skin psoriasis, which is unpleasant, but not life-threatening, and take a drug which is, not without its side effects, but is extremely effective and very profitable. Let's not forget that part. Okay, so we've read the intro, and we've found a few holes in the logic or a few other alternative explanations for the assertions in the study. Now let's look at the methods and see if any of the concerns are fixed. Now let's talk about statistical significance for a minute. 500,000 people in any study, whether it's drug effectiveness for Alzheimer's or anything that you want to possibly name, what happens when you have those kinds of numbers is a very small and not really important clinical finding will be statistically significant. But if you address it, you're only going to move the needle just a little bit. On the other hand, if it's 20 to 50,000 people, that's more likely to be something that you can make a difference, at least at the 5 to 10% of cases as a floor. And that starts to feel like something you might want to agree to pay for. But when we talk about 500,000 people, getting out of the bed on the right side or the left side could be statistically significant, but, we would say clinically meaningless. Another thing that bugged me about this is this was administered to adolescents aged 13 to 15 years at every 2-year well-child visits. The KPNC Institution Review Board approved this and waived informed consent. Why? Oh, I didn't know you could do that. Because study procedures met Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act requirements. In other words, they were going to keep the identity secret. And all KP, Kaiser Permanente North California members are informed upon enrollment in the health plan that their data may be used for research. Have you ever seen the Kaiser contract? It's like 12 pages long. And I have no doubt that somewhere in there is a couple of sentences telling you that you will be, that your data may be de-identified and used for research. Okay, well, exactly how much choice do you have in your decision to go with Kaiser Permanente? It's generally a decision that your employer makes, and your choice is take it or leave it. So, not exactly a informed consent. But we'll leave that aside, and ethical considerations aside, you can't make research without breaking a few precepts. So, how can they make this accurate? Well, one of the things they did that was good was anyone who already had been diagnosed with depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, before they answered the cannabis screening, were excluded from the outcome data. Okay, that gets rid of a confound. The question was, during the past year, did you use marijuana, yes or no? And this was done in a confidential manner. Presumably, they handed the kids a questionnaire in the exam room or the waiting room. And another confound that you've come across here in the methods that really bugged me was, if you were looking at people who had a diagnosis of psychotic behavior, bipolar behavior, depressive, and anxiety disorders, those have fairly strict DSM-5 criteria for that have to be fit. But they included people who had disruptive behavioral disorders. And disruptive behavior disorder were included as a covariate in sensitivity analysis to capture potential pre-existing psychiatric conditions that might be coded as a disruptive behavior disorder but reflect underlying or prodromal mood or psychiatric disorders that are less consistently diagnosed in adolescents. So you see how this stacks the deck in favor of statistical significance? I mean, I'm sorry, disruptive behavior disorder. That's like being a punk back when I was growing up, or a juvenile delinquent, or a JD, just somebody who couldn't follow the rules, who was always getting into trouble, and would obviously have more drug use. And so if you throw them into the group as well, you're definitely going to change the statistical analysis. And that diagnosis does not have really good criteria. So what were the results? Well, we're going to talk about something called the relative risk. And I've already mentioned 5.7 adolescents, about half of what another study showed to be the case among adolescents. And that case, the 11% one, was completely private, de-identified, and national. So in Northern California, I just do not accept that there is going to be less marijuana use than in other parts of the country. Show me your data, but I think I don't think that's an apples to apples comparison. Adolescents reporting cannabis use were more likely to have higher neighborhood disruption index, be on Medicaid, and have a higher prevalence of alcohol. To me, that maybe suggests that they come from a subculture where it's culturally normalized. Everybody smokes. There's no shame in it, so they're more likely to admit use. During the follow-up, they had, remember, this is 430,000 people. They had 4,105 diagnoses of psychotic disorder, which is about right, around 1%. That's what it usually is. And now we're going to look at the risks for the associational risk. So let's see. I'm going to find it. So the hazard risks for depressive disorder, if you had depression, the risk was 1.78 at the age of between 13 to 15, and then 1.35, and then 1.21. And by the time you get to 20, there's no association between marijuana use and depression. Psychotic disorder was the risk factor there, the hazard ratio was 2.19. For bipolar, it was about 2. So in other words, twice as likely. For depressive disorder, 1.34, and anxiety disorder, 1.24. So small differences, really. And then they go on to support this association, and they talk about experimental studies have reported an increase in psychotic experiences after IV THC exposure. And I'm like, yeah, that's a really weird thing to do. Give high dose IV THC, stand back and say, okay, well, do they freak out? I don't think that proves much about when it's taken orally or smoked, and I just feel like there's no reason to include that. It feels egregious. They also said, quote, a study in Canada that shows that there was an increased incidence of anxiety-related emergency room visits or hospitalizations following an incident emergency department visit for cannabis. Okay, who goes to the ER for cannabis? Well, really heavy users in withdrawal or children who eat up all their mother's gummies. They do make one point that I totally agree with here, and that's that high amounts of THC in early childhood, let's say under the age of 16, probably change the way your brain develops. And since cannabinoids act as a bit of a euphoric, I think if you were to use a euphoric when your brain was wiring, you might actually have an increased risk of depression because you would be essentially trying to balance yourself out of euphoria and back down to neutral. So you would kind of build extra depression muscles, so to speak, in your brain. And I know that's a really absurd way of putting it, but the whole purpose of your neuroanatomy is a wide web that balances itself. It gets pulled in one direction and then it pulls back to get to the central position, a bit like what you do when you're skiing or surfing. You know, you want to be in that balanced center and, you know, make radical moves out of it, but always be able to get back to it. How hard does the body have to tug you back, or the brain? Well, that may mean that without the cannabis, you get pulled too far in the wrong direction. They do finally say reverse causation cannot be ruled out, as some individuals may begin to use cannabis to self-medicate prodromal symptoms of psychiatric disorders. Yeah, which means you got paid to do this study, which proves exactly nothing except an association we were already aware of, and make a big splash in the news. And then they go on to say, well, you know, we can use this to justify future research at health outreach programs to mitigate risk. You know, the best outreach program to mitigate risk among the poor would be good housing and good nutrition. And, you know, let's start with that before we spend lots of money trying to get them not to smoke marijuana in childhood. I do think large amounts probably can do damage, but that is me thinking it's plausible. And I don't really believe that there is much in the way of actual data that proves that. And it'd be a very hard thing to study. Much easier to just give kids a questionnaire and blue sky off of your results. So I hope that helps you understand process. And I see we've gotten quite deep into the weeds here. Now we're going to move to fish. Fish. The food of the future. Food from the sea. Yes. 5 points to anybody who can tell me what movie I'm quoting. All right. New dietary guidelines that just came out from the feds are aimed at ending the war on protein and steering Americans towards real foods. That is to say, those with few ingredients and no additives. I have no problem with that. Seafood plays a starring role, and I'm probably a pescatarian at heart. But Over the past decades, the seafood industry has completely revolutionized how it feeds the world. Wild fish populations have plummeted, hunted to oblivion by commercial overfishing. Fish farming has become all the rage. I've seen some beautiful images of bubbles in the sea and, fish inside the bubbles. Captive breeding facilities have continually expanded. Their aquaculture is about a $300 billion juggernaut, 60% of aquatic animals now. So the majority of fish that's used by people. And proponents of aquaculture quite accurately argue that it helps feed a growing human population, that it reduces pressure on wild fish populations, lowers costs for consumers, creates new jobs. Much of that may be true, but there's a hidden crisis. Many aquaculture facilities are breeding grounds for pathogens, and they're also a blind spot for public health authorities. For one thing, it's one thing on dry land to go and inspect a factory farm. We know that some of the conditions in some of these facilities are inhumane and unsanitary, and that the animals are in conditions that promote outbreaks of disease. Aquaculture facilities aren't all that different. Most are in marine or coastal areas, and in those areas, fish can be exposed to human sewage, industrial waste, agricultural runoff, and fish are kept in close quarters. I understand that your typical backyard swimming pool, if you put 300 adult salmon in there, that would be about how much room they have to swim around. They'd be, fin to tail, literally. So when one fish gets sick, the pathogens spread widely and throughout the brood. How serious is the risk now of fish pathogens passing to humans? Not very. There's only a handful of known pathogens that can jump from aquatic species to humans. Now, seafood contributes 260,000 illnesses in the U.S. from contaminated fish, but most of those are from scromboid contamination or simply post-catch contamination with the usual suspects, Shigella, Salmonella, E. coli, and just plain old spoilage. Fish doesn't keep nearly as well as meat. So, more antibiotics are used in seafood than are used for humans or in any other farm animal per kilogram of food weight. And why? Well, for one thing, they're having to put them into water rather than into food. And that means that they have to distribute more, and a lot of it dissolves into the water. It doesn't go directly into the stomach of the fish. So a lot of those molecules settle in the water or the sediment, and they can hang around for weeks. Meanwhile, there's 1 million individual bacteria in every drop of seawater, and they're going to filter down to the sediment and be put to the evolutionary test. And the most antibiotic resistant will endure and proliferate. Is there proof? Well, here's some circumstantial evidence. Numerous researchers have found that drug-resistant strains of bacteria are alarmingly common in the water surrounding aquaculture facilities. In one study, evidence of antibiotic resistance was found in over 80% of the species of bacteria isolated from shrimp sold in multiple countries by multiple brands. Most drug-resistant strains of bacteria in aquatic animals won't infect humans, but their genes still pose a threat because bacteria do something really interesting called horizontal transfer. They're genetic hoarders. They collect DNA from their environment and they store it away in their own genome. And then they go to cross-species swap meets and they trade genes with other non-same species bacteria to expand their collections of genes. They trade for different types of antibiotic resistance. Beginning in 1991, for example, a wave of cholera infected nearly 1 million people across Latin America, exacerbated by a strain that may have been picked up by drug resistance adaptations while circulating through shrimp farms in Ecuador. As a doctor, I'm deeply fearful of a future in which the global supply of fish becomes a source of untreatable Salmonella, Campylobacter and bacteria. We need safer seafood. Governments need to crack down on indiscriminate antibiotic use. Just tax it. Estimated that 70% of all antibiotics used globally are given to farm animals. I just came back from Indonesia, and I've got a little bit of rudimentary Bahasa Indonesia at this point, and working on more, but in a sort of three-way conversation between a bilingual Balinese and a farmer, I learned something very interesting. The use of pesticides and chemical fertilizers, they're available in Indonesia, but they are taxed. There's a hefty tariff on them, so to speak. Tariff's the wrong word. They simply have a high tax. That means that the farmers can't really afford to overuse them, and it's worth the trouble of composting and doing all of the healthy organic things because they save money on the production. It comes down to the financial bottom line, but the government has to be willing to tax it. And I'm sure there are people buying, gray market fertilizer in Indonesia, but it's certainly not just the load up the truck and head off to the field way that it's done in the United States. Antibiotic resistant genes have already been identified in seafood imported into the United States, which I will add is most of the seafood in the U.S. So it's not so much what we do at home, it's what we encourage other countries to do abroad. So first thing, and I do love sushi, but you're going to want to go with local sushi, and you're taking your chances. Seeking out and freshwater sushi, the parasites and worms in freshwater sushi are more likely to be able to transfer to you. So I do encourage saltwater fish or saltwater creatures, because there's more than fish to sushi. And really, I encourage cooked fish. But I encourage fish. I just think that there's some handwriting on the wall of how we need to become prudent and proactive to keep that from becoming a problem. So let's talk about a little bit about vaccines. This is a very recent article. This would have been, late February. Vaccine maker Moderna announced that the Food and Drug Administration rejected its request to review a newly developed mRNA flu shot for those over 50. This is in spite of the fact that a trial of the vaccine of nearly 41,000 people found the shot to be 27% more effective at preventing illness and 29% more effective at preventing hospitalization than existing vaccines. I might also say that another vaccine, also mRNA-based, that would not require reworking every year for influenza, because it would be going after one of the conserved regions rather than one of the rapidly mutated regions, is also in jeopardy. These things need to be funded by private equity. And if you fund it and develop it and you're expecting to make back your millions of or hundreds of millions of dollars investment, and the FDA says, we changed our mind. We're not going to even review your application. The FDA indicated it didn't even consider approving the Moderna vaccine, ostensibly because it objected about how the trials were constructed. This is really a bias against mRNA, which has gotten politicized, and there is no good data that mRNA vaccines are bad or worse or different, except they're more effective, but certainly not any evidence that they're more dangerous than plain old-fashioned vaccines. It's hard to know where this comes from, but it doesn't make sense, and probably minimum thousands of people will die of the flu in the next couple of years because they didn't get this shot, which is more likely to keep them in the hospital. It'll just be a little blip in the data, unless it happens to be your grandmother. And you'll never be able to really blame anybody because people get the flu and die, right? Who will know? Who will be able to prove that this action did anything at all. Well, maybe some statisticians will have something suggestive, but again, it's just easy to ignore. Drug and vaccine developers rely on regulatory certainty, especially venture capital. They want to make their money back. Blackstone Life Sciences put up $750 million for that Moderna shot. Do you think they're going to make another investment in vaccines in the near future? And now we've packed the boards that approve or disapprove the vaccines with people who come in with an anti-vax attitude. We've just handed over this high level and very important scientific research to other countries, and we'll be buying our vaccines from China. Did we live here in our culture through a vaccine gold rush? Is this backlash against vaccines justified? Well, I don't think it's. I think both. The answer to the first one is yes. We lived through a vaccine gold rush. The government would pay for any vaccine you could develop that worked, and vaccines were developed for diseases that probably did not need vaccines, but it was for children and it would be paid for. So we probably did give a lot of child vaccines of marginal utility. Yeah, probably. But throwing out the tech that would allow rapid development and deployment of vaccines, new vaccines against emerging diseases, this is colossally stupid, beyond lame. It is colossally stupid and irresponsibly endangers the public, not just the United States, but many other countries as well, because we had a fabulous engine for development and a fast engine for development, and we're busy dismantling it, essentially as a victim of power politics. So, speaking of a different kind of disease, that is the disease of viral contagion online. YouTube health videos have amassed more than 200 billion views, and people now Google medical health, questions hundreds of millions of times a day. AI is going to make the internet an even bigger part of wellness. A recent poll by Ipsos found that nearly 30% of British responders get medical advice from large language models. 40 million people worldwide use ChatGPT. At last survey, it's probably doubled by now. The benefits are clear, but there's a problem. While you may get answers fast and you may get them that you would have been too embarrassed to ask about, you may not be getting the straight story, because wellness, there's something evolving called the wellness industrial complex. And this is pharmaceuticals, this is tech and testing, which are going hand in hand. You've got the AIs, but you've also got people doing DNA tests, people doing metabolomics tests for cancer, and they throw statistics at you that look awfully good. 99% sensitivity. Sounds great, except that it's going to have it's 10 times more false positives than true positives. So, yeah, maybe not as good as it sounds. Supplement firms, oh my God, the supplement industry and the wellness industry, the people doing videos and acting as health influencers. For every doctor that posts about medicine, like myself, there are more life coaches, health podcasters, charlatans. There are people who are acting in good faith but may be mistaken. There are people who are not acting in good faith and who may be very persuasive and may be actually lying. And the internet has changed health in three ways. Used to be the presumption that people had was that they were well, but the presumption is shifting to that they're sick. A good example is attention hyperactivity disorder. In recent years, people are coming. This used to be a disease of childhood, but in the last 5 years, there's been a 400% increase in people showing up at medical clinics in Great Britain seeking a diagnosis, and you can't prove a negative. So probably those people are walking out with a prescription. A lot of times, and I see this all the time, and I don't click on it, but you'll see videos, or I use Pinterest a lot, so I'll see Pinterest secret signs to look out for, clues. Clues that you have ADHD? Do you struggle to finish a book unless it's something you're interested in? Yeah, that's population normal behavior. If the book is boring, you don't finish it, unless Professor X has a gun to your head. In 2023, an analysis of the most watched ADHD videos on TikTok found that less than 50% accurately reflected the actual symptoms. But ordinary behaviors are being pathologized. The videos are appealing. They're pretty people. You relate to them. They go viral. This just helps fuel the drug industry. The other thing to realize is that the United States and New Zealand are the only countries that allow direct-to-consumer advertising of drugs. But online, you can't regulate it. Those ads go everywhere. And a lot of them are Trojan horse ads. There are influencers, the multiple sclerosis mom who's raising 2 children and living at home and is an expert on alternative management for multiple sclerosis and just happens to be getting payment in exchange for mentioning certain companies' products. And they may even tell you that, but it doesn't stop people from making the association. And if they decide to try that product, they're much more likely to try the one whose name they heard of, that's someone that they like. This online actor basically told them was good. It reminds me of actresses in the 1950s. I remember Betty Friedan worked for Westinghouse, and she was not Betty Friedan, Betty somebody worked for Westinghouse, and she was always there in her 1950s full skirted thing, caressing the refrigerators, and it worked. This was an actress who had lots of movies and a following and fans, and it sold more refrigerators. The positive association works. You'll come across video with the title like, "This common food is feeding your cancer cells," and it'll get millions of views. And of course, we've got people like Joe Rogan and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. who have juiced the testosterone trend, if you will. And often the side effects and the risks of this are just glossed over as if they didn't exist. I mean, if I'd use testosterone in many of my male patients, we go over the risks and benefits. We treat appropriately. We're not trying to turn them into Arnolds. We're trying to turn them into people with a reasonable muscle mass and help treat their diabetes. And it is effective for that if the person uses it properly and exercises and follows an appropriate high-protein diet. It is a useful adjuvant in the management of this disease. But again, just like people telling the truth to the epidemiologists, people don't always tell the truth to their doctor about whether they're following just the easy parts of the plan and not the hard parts, like showing up at the gym. It also clogs up medical offices. I'm very lucky because my medical practice is such that I can take time to sit down with my patients and look at what they bring in that they pulled off the internet, or look at a test that they got that they don't understand how to interpret that they think says that they have cancer. I run into these things all the time, and I just can't imagine how hard it is for a doctor who doesn't have the kind of time I have with their patients. We've got a call coming in, so we're going to just make sure I push the right buttons here. Hello, you're on the air. Please turn off your radio if you haven't already done so.
I have, yes.
All right, please tell me your name and where you're calling from.
My name is Milton Clark.
Oh, Milton, I had an uncle.
Currently from Aptos.
I had an uncle, Milton.
And I am curious, and this may or may not be an appropriate topic, but I'm being faced with a situation where my Medicare Advantage plan was terminated at the end of last year,
Mm-hmm.
And in trying to find another plan, I'm finding that none of the plans that are going to be available to me have enough resources here on this side of the hill. They want to send me for treatments over to Santa Clara County, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm faced with a situation where I may end up deciding that I will not sign up for health insurance at all, and not quite sure how to navigate that.
Well, you have other options besides Medicare Advantage.
Right.
So how long, first of all, if you don't mind, how old are you?
72.
Okay. So you probably signed up, well, obviously after 65, so somewhere in the last 8 years. And have you been in a Medicare Advantage that whole time?
Yes.
Okay. So Medicare Advantage was, it was essentially a grab and gut kind of operation. You set up a very good-looking benefits package. You sell it to people. You get an extra margin of pay from the government, so more than regular straight Medicare reimbursement, with the idea that you're going to spend some of that money to offer wellness services and monitor patients more carefully and keep them healthier, so you will avoid the really expensive stuff like the broken hips and the operations and et cetera. And so that was the pitch, and that was what was supposed to happen. But what happened was that they took the money and ran, and they didn't actually build any of their programs, so their costs caught up with them over the years as people in their plans started to get into their mid-70s and start to develop more problems. And the government, meanwhile, started cutting that juicy extra edge in payment that they were getting. And so a lot of them just kind of decided this was no longer a profitable business for them, or they restructured and essentially changed their panels. And I think when you're looking at Medicare Advantage, and I haven't explored it specifically, but I think that we do not have a doctor excess here on this side of the hill. And so we don't have to accept the lowball contract, whereas there are much larger entities on the other side of the hill who, for whatever reason, because are willing to accept the rates that are paid by the Medicare Advantage plans that still remain. So market penetration locally for Medicare Advantage is definitely receding like the tide before a tidal wave. And I don't know where that's going to go. I would reach out to online to this. First of all, there's senior services. Sorry, I don't have their phone number to give you, but there are senior services. Call Gray Bears and ask them, who can help me navigate Medicare, and they will have resources for you. The AARP has free resources, 800 number and all of that. And they'll take a look at your situation. They'll help walk you through the options. You're probably going to end up with something like just regular Medicare, which will cover about 80% of your costs. And then you have to most people will select a Medicare secondary, but not everyone does that. A lot depends on your income. There's assistance plans still available through California Care that fold people into a Medicare secondary, and so there's stuff out there for you, but you have to hunt for it. It's not going to be advertised. It's just not where they're going to put their money. But the people who are out there to help you to do good, which is to say volunteer organizations or AARP has good information, and so you'll be able to access good information if you just take the time to look for it.
Right, and I guess the big challenge that I'm faced with right now is that the doctors that I've been using pretty much only accept Advantage plans, and so if I go with either regular Medicare or even an HMO, I'm faced with situations where I won't be able to use the same doctors or in the situation I'm looking at now, I can't find a doctor that's even available, that's even accepting new patients on this side of the hill. So it's pretty sparse at this point in terms of choices. Yeah.
Yeah, I understand. Are you in a position to work with a direct pay practice? They still have open panels. The problem there is, it gets complicated. I don't want to spend too much time here on the air. I would recommend calling Gray Bears and see if they've got someone locally, or I believe there's a local seniors organization. And if anybody has the number on that and wants to shoot me a quick email, we've still got 5. I can put that out. Actually, we don't have 5 minutes. We've got 1 minute. But I'll go ahead if I find something, and I'll post it on the resource section of the Ask Dr. Don website. Probably should be doing that anyway. So thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you, Milton, for the call, because it's spurred me to do something that will probably benefit a lot of people, and maybe even you.
Yes, thank you so much. Appreciate your help.
Good luck. And as I say on the show, so long and stay healthy.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Well, that's about all for this week's podcast. Please go to AskDrDon.com for news about our future plans. For now, this is Dr. Don saying so long and stay healthy.
Ask Dr. Don is brought to you by Jiva Media. Production and editing by Charles Bansky. Music by John Scoville.